All right, welcome to the demo portion of the class. For this section, I'm going to take you through a whole series of drawings so that we can dig in and figure out how to break down the complexities of the head simply and clearly. We're going to get you good at this. And so to do that, I've picked out one of my favorite models for us to work from. We're going to be working from the following image. And as you can see, this is a guy who has real character to his face and real opportunities for construction drawing. So let's go ahead and show you what the finished product looks like. This is a 15-minute drawing, folks. This does not have to be difficult. Let me show you how here as we move into the demo. So I'm going to start out just by positioning the head on the page. Now don't take this as gospel truth. It just so happens that my hand is about the distance that I typically like to make a head study, a little bit smaller than life size. And so that's why you see me put my hand down there. Now obviously your hand is probably sized differently than mine. So the principle here is, and I'll throw this to you as a generalization, that portrait artists tend to like to work a little bit smaller than life size. It feels natural. Every head that we see, every person that we come in contact with, we see them in perspective, so to speak, right? And so it feels right to have their head slightly smaller than life size. And for a study, maybe even a little bit smaller than that, which is the size that I'm working here. So I give myself a position on the page where I want the head to be. I commit to what size so I have a whole frame to work in. And then as you see, I simply put down the ball and egg shape. Very simple. Then I find my center line, so I have the simplest possible statement about the portions and the proportions of the head. Center line, if you're looking straight on at your model, tends to be about halfway through, and then the eyes tend to be about equidistant from each other, but of course they're in perspective here, so it diminishes the closest eye, and then the space between, and then the next eye, and each of those three spaces are identical straight on, but from my 3/4 angle here in perspective. So I like to draw in this circle, and I know that's maybe a little bit different for you, and it might be a little confusing because it's an abstraction. Eventually disappear into the drawing, but here's why. One, it gives me my simple shape, my simple proportion to work with. And number two, it represents the eyeball. Remember, we're pulling out all of the stops to get a sense of three-dimensionality to our head. And as we draw the eyelids and the irises and the pupils, each of those things has to conform to the round three-dimensional eyeball shape. Those eyelids that you'll see in a moment, they need to wrap around that in perspective. I need to think about those eyes as a sphere. So that's what I'm thinking about there. The corners of the nose tend to line up with the inside of the eyes. The corners of the mouth tend to line up with the center of the eyes. So you see me dropping those plumb lines down, following in parallel the center line, making absolutely sure that everything about my head is clearly and simply symmetrical. Again, those are generalizations. Some people have a little bit wider nose. Some people have a little bit narrower nose. But on average, those things line up. Same issues with the mouth. So I'm simply constructing where the features are on the head and then starting to get their three-dimensional nature. For instance, you see I've already put in an underplane on the nose to help me get that 3D sense. You'll also notice that I've put in the brow ridge, that mass up above the eyes. And as you're looking at the inset model there, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, it goes in and then out, it kind of caves back in between his brows, and it goes out again. Well, remember, we're doing everything we can not to get lost in the complexities. We just spent a great deal of time in the lecture and the lesson talking about the importance of that. And so Yes, there's a lot of variation in that brow ridge, but remember, we're doing the simplest thing first. One big mass that wraps all the way around the head so everything is simple and symmetrical. And then we add the variations to it afterwards. That nose, now noses can be very difficult until you think of them as a front plane, a side plane, and an underplane. You'll see me do that. He has a complicated nose. It's hard, it gets busy. You try and do all those organic curves and then they don't make sense. Just do a front plane, a side plane, and if appropriate, an underplane. And then you can add the ball shape on the end of the nose. See me constructing that now. I want you to also notice the way that I make sure and double check the distance of my nose. It's very difficult for me to do that accurately. It's hard for me to judge the distance from the eye to the bottom of the nose. It's a mistake I make all the time. But see the bottom of the circle? For instance, let's say the right-hand side eye. The bottom of that circle, and then you go down a bit, and I have a line there that connects to the nose that wraps around the mouth. That shape that wraps around the muzzle of the mouth. That's an easy distance to judge. And then the distance from that line to the bottom of the nose is just about a centimeter there. That's very easy to judge. Each of those little steps are easy to judge, but from the eyebrow all the way down to the bottom of the nose is very hard to judge. I did so many drawings back when I was a student where I was kind of proud of the drawing, except it had this horribly mislengthened nose. I still have the same problem, but not when I break it down into those simple pieces. So now I'm placing the eyelids. Again, see how I'm wrapping it around the eye, treating the eye as a sphere, and now I'm putting the pupils and the irises in, positioning those. Okay, wraparound shapes, you see, that sphere is just helping me, even though, as I say, that sphere, that circle I initially drew for the eyes, and especially, this is not going to be a tonal drawing, but when you take a drawing into tone, yeah, that circle eventually completely disappears, but it informs everything that you lay on top of it. Look at the inset model and look at how everything around his eyes wraps around a spherical shape. So important to get the simple statement. That's also why we have that shape wrapping around the muzzle of the mouth. It's a simple shape that we all have with the forms and the musculatures that wrap around it. So now I'm constructing the far side of the face on the left there, and I'm making sure I get overlaps in there. One form wrapping around from behind, the other form, and then coming around front, and then another form coming out from behind that and wrapping around front. More on that later. And you see how important the symmetry was, how doggedly careful I was to stick towards everything being symmetrical and aligned. It is so easy for your drawing to drift on you. We have this tendency that we'll talk about from today until the end of the class. We'll constantly be talking about our tendency to lose the forest for the trees, to get caught up on the immediate area that we're working in, but it drifts out of context with the whole. That's a natural human tendency, as we've discussed. We cannot let it happen. That's why I'm always drawing the big forms that wrap all the way around the head first, to guarantee that that common mistake that knocks all of the amateurs and beginners, that knocks them off their feet, that's not going to be us. We will not allow it to happen. So finding the position of the ear, I'm going to show you in a minute how I drew the ear wrong. Hey, I actually, you'll see at the end, I was pretty pleased with the accuracy of the drawing, but the back of the head and the ear I got wrong. So we're going to look at what my mistake was here in a few minutes. But I am positioning it, I am thinking properly about where to place the ear. I'm making sure that it lines up, looking at where it matches up with the eye and the eyebrow, and finding that spot and then positioning it in context there. Simple lines for the neck. Yes, the neck and all of the musculature within it and the way it connects to the shoulders and the shirt around it. Very complicated, but just treat it as a simple cylinder. Your drawings will go south on you so fast. They always will, for me too, if you don't get the simple shape that's accurate first. And I say that because it's really true. We really do make these drawings harder than they have to be, more complicated than they have to be. If we're methodical and thoughtful rather than drifting off on autopilot, you'll be surprised with practice how you can bang out accurate drawings. Now, I don't mean to break my arm trying to pat myself on the back here, but this is a 15-minute drawing. It took just 15 minutes to take this from start to finish, and then were we in a value stage in the class, we'll get to it in a couple of weeks, value meaning light and shadow, we would be able to dive right into that light and shadow, block in big simple statements of the masses of light and shadow, and then get some of the edges and nuances, and then do a little detail work and fine tuning, and you will be so pleasantly surprised how you can make these drawings fall into place. That's my promise to you, but my promise is also this. It takes it's simple, but it takes an extraordinary amount of practice to get all of the simple steps into place and familiar for you. That's why your homework is so important in this class. Okay, so you see me continuing to construct overall the head. I'm thinking about it three-dimensionally. Maybe some of you are familiar with, for instance, a three-dimensional wireframe on a computer. You know, that kind of digital model that's made only out of lines, and you can rotate it and it's made all out of lines. They call it a wireframe. That's how we're thinking about the whole head as we're constructing it here. You'll also notice a moment ago I put in that circle. It's the bottom of the cheek that wraps around and connects with the mouth. That's another area that gets a lot of beginners into hot water. They'll draw the cheek on one side, and then they'll draw another part. You know, they'll move on to the eye or some other part, and then later on they'll get to the cheek on the other side and won't even realize that they've made one higher, one lower, one bigger, one smaller. But if you wrap that cheek, remember, symmetrical once again. You start on one side, you wrap that line all the way around, and on many people it intersects right through the mouth. Now, of course, it varies from person to person, but on average it does do that. All the way around the head. It guarantees you that symmetry that's so important. Now, connect the neck to the shoulders. The shoulders come out from behind, and so that neck comes down below the shoulders. See how I treated it as a cylinder? See how I did that wraparound line to help me know, remember, and understand its simple shape? And then I added a couple of the lines, the long line of the muscle coming down from the chin, for instance, and the collarbone down there. So I'm taking a look here and just making some decisions. Those lines I'm drawing now, so those represent the big shape of the cheek. That line that comes off the top of the ear that I'm conveniently covering up so you can't see it. That line coming off the top of the ear and intersecting right under the eyeball, that represents the top of the cheek. Don't think of the cheek as a bunch of little pieces and parts. Once again, that will hurt you. Think of it as one big simple mass. If you have to be official about it, it's the zygomatic process, that whole thing. But I frankly, I do care about anatomy. I don't care much about anatomical terms. I care about accurate anatomy, but I also care about treating the anatomy, the complexities of the anatomy, in a way that illuminates the simplicities of the form. So I am an anatomy guy, but I do think that some people who only care about anatomy start coming up with drawings that look like a sack of walnuts, because only the anatomy is emphasized at the expense of the whole simple statement. And that, I think, is important to avoid. Hence the kind of approach that I'm encouraging here. So once again, back to that cheek. What is that middle line? We have that underside of the cheek wrapping around and intersecting the mouth. We have that top part of the cheek. That middle line just represents the crest of the form. If there were a halfway point, the point at which the cheek stood out the most, that's just giving us that halfway point. So I'm constructing, notice how everything wraps around. These lines that I'm drawing wrapping around the mouth, the lips, the plane underneath the lips there. Notice how it wraps all the way, it continues and wraps all the way around the mouth. That guarantees that your drawings don't have that piecemeal sack of walnuts quality. And then he has that big shape of musculature that wraps from underneath his eyes and wraps all the way around his mouth and his chin, that wraparound shape. And then he has a crease that wraps across that. And so right now I'm drawing that crease. Don't let that crease fool you. It's a fold on the top layer of skin, but underneath it is a muscle mass that wraps around the mouth and starts underneath the eyes. So that's it. That takes it to completion. If you want to pause and take a closer look at the drawing there, you're welcome to do that. It behooves you, it suits you to study it. But here's how it is working on our character here. So here's where I missed. You see, I didn't give him enough cranium in the back of the head, and I was a little bit small on the ear. But take a look at the features, if you don't mind me saying so. I got it about right. And with that, I want to make a further point then, go even simpler.